It's official now. Not a rumor. Not an insider report. Not a maybe.
Todd Monken stood in front of his team, and then in front of the cameras, and confirmed it directly. Shedeur Sanders is the starting quarterback for the Cleveland Browns this Friday night against the Buffalo Bills.
QB1. First team offense. The full first half.
And after everything that happened just 1 week ago in Chicago, that single confirmation just turned an already tense quarterback competition into something with real, immediate consequences.
Because now, there's nowhere left to hide.
This is the week Shedeur Sanders has to answer, out loud, on the field, in front of everyone. Quick subscribe if you're following this quarterback battle, because this week just became the most important one of the entire preseason.
Let's get the facts straight first, because the sequence here matters enormously.
Deshaun Watson started the Browns' preseason opener against the Bears, playing the first half against Chicago's starting defense before Sanders took over for the second half. Watson threw for 126 yards, didn't turn the ball over, and looked genuinely sharp for a player returning from a torn Achilles for the first time in nearly 2 years. It was a real, meaningful milestone for him personally, stepping back onto a competitive football field after undergoing a second surgery on that same Achilles back in January, a rehab process that stretched across the entirety of the 2025 season and left him without a single competitive snap for nearly 2 full years. Sanders, entering later in a game that had already started to unravel, finished 6 of 11 for 79 yards, with an interception that came on an overthrow, picked off by Bears cornerback Beanie Bishop. The Browns lost that game 34-10, a collapse that started with Cleveland actually leading 10-0 before Chicago scored 34 unanswered points the rest of the way. It's worth remembering just how promising that opening stretch actually looked before everything fell apart, Cleveland outgaining Chicago 120 yards to 14 through the first quarter alone. That context matters, because it means the final score doesn't tell the full story of either quarterback's individual performance, even though Sanders' specific mistake, an overthrow that turned into a turnover, became the detail that stuck with people once the dust settled. Sanders didn't try to spin his own mistake afterward, either, and it's worth hearing exactly how he described it.
It was the right read, he told reporters. It just slipped. That's what makes me be mad a little bit because of it. I just didn't execute the decision.
But the right decision was made.
That's a specific, honest, technical explanation, not an excuse.
He wasn't blaming the receiver, the coverage, or the game situation. He was owning a physical execution error, a missed throw on a play he says he read correctly. That kind of accountability matters, but it doesn't erase the fact that the throw still ended up in an opponent's hands, in a game that was already being watched as a referendum on this entire competition. It's worth pausing on that specific distinction, because it's exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost once a box score starts circulating.
Sanders wasn't confused about coverage. He wasn't locked onto the wrong receiver. By his own account, and by the account of reporters breaking down the play afterward, the decision itself was sound, the read was correct, and the ball simply didn't come out clean. That's a mechanical, physical mistake rather than a mental or processing one, and the two carry very different weight when a coaching staff sits down to evaluate what actually needs fixing. A processing error suggests a quarterback isn't seeing the field correctly. A physical execution error suggests the decision-making is already sound, and the correction needed is far more specific and, in theory, far more fixable heading into the next opportunity. And it's not the only interception that happened in that game either, which adds important context to how Cleveland's coaching staff is likely reading the whole picture. Third-string quarterback Dillon Gabriel also threw a pick during his own stretch of that same contest, meaning two different Browns quarterbacks, working behind two different levels of pass protection against a defense that had built real confidence as the game wore on, both walked away with turnovers in that same lopsided loss. That doesn't erase Sanders' specific mistake, but it does complicate any narrative that tries to isolate his one interception as somehow uniquely damning, separate from the broader pattern of a rough, sloppy team performance across the entire second half of that game. Now fast forward to this week, and here's exactly what Monken confirmed. Sanders will start against Buffalo. Full first-team reps, a genuine half of football against Buffalo's actual starting defense, not a rotating group of backups deep into a blowout. Monken has been explicit about why this specific structure matters. It'll be a little bit more difficult with the player that doesn't play as much this week, he said,
describing how the evaluation works. We'll be able to assess the quarterback that started and how he played, and when the other quarterbacks came in, and then the opposite will be next week against Buffalo. Translation: this is Sanders' turn to get the exact same fair, full-strength opportunity Watson just got in Chicago. No excuses left about facing backups, or entering mid-game, or working through a rotation that had already shifted the level of competition. Just Sanders, the starting job on the line, and Buffalo's Real defense standing across from him. And that's exactly why this specific week carries so much weight. Every argument being made about Watson looking sharper after Chicago was built on him facing a legitimate, organized starting defense from the opening snap. Sanders is about to get that same setup for himself. If he plays clean, efficient, mistake-free football under those exact conditions, the entire framing of this competition shifts immediately, because the one legitimate structural excuse attached to his uneven half in Chicago disappears completely. And if the same kind of costly mistake shows up again, this time with no rotation, no shifting competition level, and no diminished stakes to point to, that tells Monken's coaching staff something far more concrete than one uneven half in a blowout loss ever could. It's worth explaining exactly why that structural fairness matters so much for anyone trying to genuinely evaluate this competition from the outside. A quarterback entering a game midway through, against a defense that's already begun rotating in backup and roster bubble players, is facing a fundamentally different puzzle than a quarterback opening that same game against a defense's most organized, most cohesive starting group. Communication, disguise, and overall execution tend to be sharper among players who've spent months building chemistry together, and noticeably rougher among backups still working out basic timing with each other. Watson benefited from facing the sharper version of Chicago's defense. Sanders, in the second half, faced the rougher, still forming version. Buffalo removes that asymmetry entirely. Both quarterbacks are now getting evaluated against a genuine, undiluted starting caliber defense, which is exactly the kind of apples-to-apples comparison a fair, thorough competition actually requires. There's also a specific challenge sitting underneath this opportunity that Monken has already put directly on the record. He said his focus with Sanders has been on getting in and out of the huddle a little cleaner, being a little faster with his decision-making, so that as a coach, he doesn't have anxiety coaching him. Read that carefully, because it's not about arm talent or accuracy. It's about trust, about the operational cleanliness that lets a coaching staff hand a quarterback the keys to an entire offense without worrying, snap to snap, whether the huddle is going to break on time or whether hesitation is going to bleed into a costly mistake. Buffalo isn't just a chance for Sanders to throw for more yards than he did against Chicago. It's a direct opportunity to answer that exact challenge, the one Monken named specifically and publicly. Think about how unusual it actually is for a head coach to name a challenge this specifically, in public, rather than keeping that kind of developmental feedback confined to film sessions and private conversations. Coaches choose their public words carefully, especially during an unresolved competition this closely watched. When Monken specifically used the word anxiety, describing his own internal state as a coach when Sanders' operation isn't clean enough, he wasn't offering a vague, generic critique. He was giving Sanders, and everyone watching this competition from the outside, an unusually precise roadmap for exactly what separates him from full, unreserved trust at the position. That kind of specificity cuts both ways. It gives Sanders a clear, actionable target. It also means there's no ambiguity left about what a clean, confident performance against Buffalo would actually prove. And the stakes go even further this week, because before Sanders even takes his first live snap against Buffalo, he's getting real, live competitive reps against that exact opponent. The Browns and Bills are holding a joint practice ahead of the game itself, giving both quarterbacks direct work against Buffalo's actual scheme, actual disguises, and actual pressure looks, splitting first-team reps between Sanders and Watson as evenly as the situation allows. Monken has acknowledged that split won't be perfectly even, since a joint practice creates different situational blocks of work rather than two identical, symmetrical opportunities. But it still means Sanders walks into Friday's game having already seen live, competitive glimpses of exactly the defense he's about to face, a meaningfully different level of preparation than what either quarterback had heading into the completely unfamiliar Chicago defense the week before. Joint practices carry a specific kind of value that regular training camp reps against your own defense simply can't replicate. When Cleveland's offense practices against Cleveland's own defense, both units already know each other intimately, from tendencies down to individual body language cues that tip off a coming blitz or coverage rotation. That familiarity strips away a huge amount of the genuine unpredictability a quarterback faces in an actual game. A joint practice against an entirely different team's defensive personnel restores much of that unpredictability, forcing a quarterback to read genuinely unfamiliar disguises and genuinely unfamiliar pressure combinations in real time, closer to what an actual regular season opponent would present. Sanders getting a real dose of that specific kind of preparation, directly against the exact opponent he's about to face in a live game, is a meaningfully different circumstance than what either quarterback had walking into Chicago. So why does all of this add up to real pressure, real spotlight, real stakes for Sanders specifically this week?
Because this isn't happening in a vacuum.
It's happening after a rough, publicly dissected outing against the Bears, with insiders and analysts already starting to lean toward Watson as the emerging favorite based on that one specific game. It's happening with Cleveland's own unofficial depth chart still listing both quarterbacks as co-starters, a deliberate signal from the organization that nothing has actually been settled. And it's happening with Monken himself having already named, specifically and publicly, exactly what he wants to see corrected. That's about as clear a spotlight as a young quarterback can be handed heading into a single preseason game.
Not vague pressure to simply play well.
A specific, publicly issued challenge, delivered by his own head coach, that Sanders now has to answer directly, on the field, this Friday.
And that spotlight isn't just coming from inside the building either.
It's coming from every corner of the national football media that covers this competition closely. Analysts have already started publicly picking sides based on the Chicago game, insider reports have circulated about Watson's apparent edge in recent practices, and the entire conversation around this quarterback battle has taken on a real sense of urgency heading into this specific matchup. That's the environment Sanders is stepping into this week, not a low-stakes, forgettable preseason snap count, but a genuinely charged moment where a young quarterback fighting for both his own job security and a chance to rewrite an unflattering national narrative gets one clean, fair shot to do exactly that, under conditions specifically designed to give him no excuses if it doesn't go well. And it's worth remembering just how much this specific opponent has already meant to Sanders' young career, in a completely different context.
Go back to week 16 of his rookie season, when Sanders and the Browns hosted a 9-4 Buffalo team that was fighting for playoff positioning. That's the exact caliber of opponent Sanders is stepping back onto the field against now, a legitimate, well-coached roster that isn't simply rolling out backups to burn clock in a meaningless exhibition. Whatever happens this Friday, it's happening against a real measuring stick, not a soft, forgettable opponent that lets a shaky performance hide behind low stakes. Buffalo's organization has built a genuine reputation across recent seasons for fielding disciplined, well-coached rosters from top to bottom, not just at the starting level but deep into their depth chart as well. That reputation matters heading into Friday, because it means Sanders isn't just facing Buffalo's most talented 11 players. He's facing a program-wide standard of preparation and execution that tends to hold up even once a coaching staff starts rotating in backups and roster bubble players as a preseason game wears on. That's a meaningfully different challenge than what either Browns quarterback faced against Chicago, where the drop-off in competition level became increasingly visible as the game moved deeper into its second half. Buffalo's structural consistency, top to bottom, is exactly the kind of test that should produce a genuinely clean read on where Sanders actually stands, without the same kind of asymmetry that clouded the evaluation from Chicago. None of this guarantees which way Friday actually goes, and it shouldn't. That's exactly the point of building this entire evaluation around two separate, fair, standalone tests instead of rushing to a verdict off one uneven half of preseason football. Watson earned real credit for his performance in Chicago, and that credit is fully deserved. But the idea that this competition has already been effectively decided ignores exactly how deliberately Monken built this process, and exactly how directly he's already told Sanders what needs to improve before this exact opportunity arrived. Friday night against Buffalo is Sanders' answer, delivered under the same fair conditions Watson just benefited from himself, against the same specific challenge his own coach put in front of him in plain, public language. And whatever the outcome, it's worth remembering that this single game, however important, still isn't the final word on this competition either way. Monken has been consistent, from the very first week of camp, that he doesn't need to name a Week 1 starter until Cleveland's regular season opener against Jacksonville in September,
well beyond both of these preseason contests. That means even a genuinely strong performance from Sanders on Friday doesn't automatically hand him the job outright, just as Watson's encouraging outing in Chicago didn't. What it does is add another significant, meaningful data point to a body of evidence that's still actively being built, one that Monken has said, repeatedly and consistently, he intends to assess fully and fairly before making the biggest decision of his first season as an NFL head coach. So here's what to actually watch for once that first-team offense trots out onto that field on Friday. Watch the huddle. Watch how quickly it breaks, how decisively Sanders gets the offense set at the line, exactly the operational cleanliness Monken named as the specific thing he wants to see. Watch the decision-making tempo, whether Sanders is moving through his reads with real conviction or hesitating in ways that invite exactly the kind of pressure and negative plays that have hurt him before. And watch that turnover column above everything else, because Monken has already made painfully clear, in blunt terms after the Bears game, exactly how much weight turnovers carry in this entire evaluation.
A clean, mistake-free half against Buffalo's Real defense doesn't just erase the memory of one overthrown interception in Chicago. It directly answers the exact challenge Monken issued, in the exact setting built specifically to test it. Beyond the obvious box score numbers, pay attention to how Sanders handles the specific moments that tend to separate a genuinely composed starter from one still finding his footing under real pressure: third and long conversions, red zone efficiency once the field compresses and throwing windows shrink, and his response after any early mistake if one happens. A quarterback who can absorb an early setback without letting it snowball into a second or third compounding error shows exactly the kind of operational stability Monken has been asking for all camp. Conversely, watch for whether pressure from Buffalo's front, a legitimate NFL pass rush rather than a rotating group still finding its chemistry, forces the same kind of hurried decision-making that's occasionally shown up in Sanders' game before. Every one of these smaller, situational details feeds directly into the larger verdict this game is going to help shape, regardless of how the final score itself ultimately reads. We'll be tracking every detail of this Browns quarterback competition heading into Friday's game, so make sure you're subscribed, because this is the week that could genuinely define how the rest of this competition gets read. This video is based on publicly available reporting, press conference coverage, and ongoing coverage from outlets following the Cleveland Browns 2026 preseason. Details reflect information available at the time of publishing and may evolve as the preseason continues. This content is intended for sports commentary and entertainment purposes, not as a factual or definitive statement about any player's future, character, or career outcome. If you are personally affected by anything discussed in this video, please reach out to someone you trust for support.